Greetings, everyone. My name is Johanna Chao Kreilick, and I am with the Open Society Foundations, a global rights and justice philanthropy where I am leading a major new climate action initiative. I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this session, which is on the road to COP26, a race against climate change. The aim of this session is to draw on our diverse panelists, as well as all of you in the audience. We are going to be lifting up the key issues that should shape the discussions, negotiations, and agenda leading up to and at the next COP26, which will be held next November in Glasgow. Our discussion today will take a systems change perspective, since we know that reaching the scope and scale required to avoid climate catastrophe will require transformational change across the political, economic, and financial level, and across the humanitarian, peace and security, development, rights, and justice arenas. I urge you all to bring your comments and questions to our esteemed and very eclectic set of panelists, as the main outcomes from today's roundtable will feed into the World Humanitarian Forum's next global conferences to be held in 2021 in London and then in Davos. Those outcomes we hope and expect will shape the agenda and the outcomes of COP26. So let's jump in. I want to tell you how we're going to roll today. We are going to first hear from each of our speakers, who will share just a sentence or two of brief self-introduction. Then we're going to jump into the pith of our discussion through a moderated set of questions and response that draw on our panelists' areas of expertise. And then we will turn to questions and comments from all of you around our virtual table. Let me underscore again that everyone's contributions will be needed, especially the experiences and perspectives of frontline activists and communities already deeply affected by climate change. Without more ado, let me turn to our panelists for their brief self-introduction, and after they're complete, I'll start with the questions. Over to you, Tasneem.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and hello to everybody. My name is Tasneem Essop. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Action Network International. This is one of the largest global networks of civil society working on climate change. We have over 1,300 members. We're represented in over 120 countries and on all continents in the world. And we have a very key role to play in the UNFCCC process and have been since its inception. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Over to you, Stefanos.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. My name is Stefanos Fotiou. I'm the Director of Environment and Development Division in the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. We are involved with climate change with three main lines of work. We support our member states with analytical work to understand the status of climate change in our region. We provide capacity development, especially in the areas of climate finance, climate governance, and vertical integration. And of course, we support the intergovernmental process. And our role in COP26 will be to support our member states to update and enhance the ambition of their national determined contribution. Thank you very much.
Super. And Serge, over to you.
Thank you very much, Johanna. So my name is Serge Stroobants. I'm the Director for Europe and the MENA region for the Institute for Economics and Peace, so IEP. IEP is an independent, not-for-profit think tank dedicated to shifting the way the world thinks about peace, created 15 years ago and set up to understand the interaction between business, peace, and economics, placing a special emphasis on metrics, measuring peace, enabling us also to define the economic value to any change in peace. Headquartered in Sydney, Australia, but with offices throughout the world, from Brussels to The Hague to Harare, Zimbabwe, New York City, Mexico City, and a representation in Sao Paulo. All research is being used worldwide by intergovernmental organizations, governments, businesses, academics, and the general public to understand peace, create more peaceful societies, but also to adopt more peaceful practices. So we publish every year, amongst others, the Global Peace Index, a measure of negative peace, Positive Peace Index, Global Terrorism Index, measuring the global impact of terrorism. And we just launched 2 weeks ago, and that's why I'm sitting on this panel, I guess, the inaugural Ecological Threat Register, or ETR. The aim of this ETR is to understand the interplay between ecological threats, resilience, and peace. It's covering 157 countries and 97% of the world's population, measuring ecological threats countries are facing, and also providing a projection to 2050. It is unique because it combines the analysis of the impact of the exposure, and it links this to the resilience of countries to cope with this exposure. And I'm looking forward to talk more about the ETR later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Serge. Over to you, John.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone. I'm John Furlow. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Research Institute for Climate and Society. We are part of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. We're a group of researchers, both in climate science and social sciences, sectoral sciences. We specialize in developing and training Met departments, weather departments in developing countries to produce seasonal forecasts and to translate that information into terms that are useful and meaningful to decision makers in health, agriculture, and other economic sectors that are at risk of climate variability and change. I look forward to answering questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And Tom, to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tom. I'm the Executive Director of the Arctic Ice Project. The Arctic Ice Project is the most studied ice restoration effort in the world. We are a climate restoration nonprofit that's developed a localized, safe geoengineering technique that restores ice reflectivity, increases the Earth's albedo, and therefore our solution has the potential to buy an additional 15 years for our planet to decarbonize. As it relates to why we're all here today, I think that ICE 911 represents really a new thought alliance around climate restoration, in that we believe that we need to adopt a more comprehensive or ambitious climate agenda that uses climate restoration as an additional tool in the toolkit that complements our focus on climate change mitigation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tom. So let me circle back, and I'm going to start with a question to you, Tasneem. There's so many questions I could ask, but I will start with just one. Climate Action Network International's focus for COP26 revolves around a set of key asks linked to pretty ambitious goals, climate finance and resilience building. Can you remind us what the extent and the makeup of your membership is, and give us the headlines of your coalition's key priorities for and at COP26?
Thanks, Johanna. So let me start with just a description about our membership. And as I said, we operate across the world in 120 countries. And our membership actually ranges from really local grassroots community organizations to very big international environmental NGOs. So for example, you'd be familiar with names like WWF, Greenpeace, Oxfam, etc. So they all actually belong to the Climate Action Network. So you can imagine that we have a very strong international membership, but then we also very localized and we operate at regional level. So the connections between the national, local, regional to international is something that we've been really good at doing. And so to ensure that the voices of those on the ground are actually reflected in the kinds of demands and priorities that we set for the work that we do in the UNFCCC. And just then to talk about those priorities, I think we cannot have a conversation about the path to COP26 without locating it within the current context. So, of course, our big priority as a network in these past months with the COVID pandemic has been about the response to the pandemic, but also recognizing that climate change, in fact, you know, there's been no pause button hit on climate change. And just in the month now, we've witnessed unbelievable extreme events, you know, disasters around the world, not leaving anybody behind in this instance, because the impacts have been global, north to south. We've witnessed fires in California, Siberia, the unbelievable flooding in Sudan. So one can imagine that off the back of a very difficult context of having to deal with a pandemic that has been extremely devastating, disruptive to people's lives and economies. And we then also have the climate crisis overlaying that. And the kind of impacts, especially on the poor, the most vulnerable, women and girls, blacks, people of color, indigenous communities, all of that we've already witnessed through the pandemic being laid bare, and the fault lines in terms of inequality and poverty was really exposed during the pandemic. And in addition, of course, this also applies to the same vulnerable groupings. The climate crisis is actually impacting those very constituencies who have been dealing with the pandemic as well. And so our big priority is about ensuring that the kind of COVID recovery plans and packages, I mean, people are talking about trillions of dollars being spent on this COVID recovery, that this is, the plans are aligned with the Paris Agreement, that in fact an important part of financing climate change is about financing the building of resilience. And now we know that resilience has to be built to deal with multiple crises. And again, it is, you know, addressing fundamentally things like poverty and inequality that helps to build the capability and the abilities for vulnerable communities to addressing these impacts, disasters, pandemics, etc. That's going to be the important thing. So impacts, building resilience, a very big piece of our work. So for COP26, loss and damage, and the support for loss and damage, you know, is going to be an important part of our priorities. I know that the Climate Vulnerable Forum is also making this a very big priority. We cannot ignore this any longer. You know, the less we do in terms of our mitigation actions, the more we're going to have to face the reality that we'll be dealing with extreme events in this way. The second big thing, of course, that we'll focus on is these nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. And we know all countries needed to submit those NDCs by the end of this year, when the COP was originally planned for. We haven't seen many countries actually submit. Again, mainly smaller developing countries have actually submitted, whereas we want our big major economies, the major emitters, to be stepping up and showing us that they're actually going to increase their climate ambition, that they are going to close the emissions gap that they're needing to do, and in turn make sure that they address their fair shares, their equitable contribution to the global efforts. And so we're going to focus a lot on the NDCs, how countries are going to close the gap through increasing their ambition, especially major emitters, but then particularly also to look at how NDCs already in the way countries are planning for that, that it's almost a backbone to the COVID recovery plans as well. And what we really are pushing for as civil society is that the processes to draw up these NDCs have to be inclusive, that they have to have all voices at the table. Civil society has an important role to play in the development of these NDCs. Last point, Johanna, and I know I've spoken quite a while, then we have to talk about finance. And we have to talk about finance in two ways. One, rich countries they have obligations and made commitments to what we call the pre-2020 finance, this 100 billion per year contribution, which have not been fulfilled. And so we have to hold governments accountable for what they committed to doing. And then secondly, we have the important discussion about financing in the time ahead. So 2021 to 2025, what we need. And again, this is where we need to look very creatively in how we link our COVID recovery plans to financial support. And, you know, the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General has called for massive international solidarity in addressing the pandemic, but also the climate crisis, and the financial support that rich and developed countries can make towards this is a big expression and signal for solidarity. So just to wrap up, we're really interested in impacts, loss and damage particularly. The brunt is being borne by those who are least responsible for contributing to this crisis. The second thing is for especially major emitting countries to step up. The NDCs must show that they're actually going to increase their ambition. And finally, also to ensure that we do have the kind of financial support to deal with the climate crisis, but also at the same time be able to build the kind of resilience and responses to multiple crises. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Johanna.
Thank you, Tasneem. Stefanos, let me ask you, just sort of connecting the dots with this issue of climate finance, recalibrating climate finance, and indeed our existing financial system will be necessary to affect climate change that can deliver the scale and scope we need in time. Briefly, what do you see as the barriers to shifting the climate finance ecosystem in the right direction? And what are you doing in your organization, and what do you see needs to be done by others in the lead up to COP26?
Thanks, Johanna, and thanks, Tasneem, that you mentioned the importance of climate finance for achieving everything. I think everybody has understood now that the big missing link on achieving the Paris Agreement is the finance. If I try to think about the barriers, and I'm not sure I have the entire answer to this question, because I think it's the billion-dollar question. But I would like to approach some of the barriers, and I see three sets of barriers. The first is what I would say some systemic issues with our development paradigm, and I want to use here a little bit some concepts from classical mechanics, from physics. So one thing is it's the momentum of growth. It's this continuous belief that the only way that development can happen is by economic growth. And it's this very strong association between human development and economic growth. And it has been proven that it's not always true, actually many times it's false, that economic and financial growth itself can guarantee human development, much, of course, more environmental development or sustainable development. The second thing is this classic mechanics set is the inertia. The inertia of the financing system to do things in a different way, but also the inertia of the other economic actors to do things in another way. And I will say the third, and again, I'm finishing here with my analogy with the classic mechanics, is friction. It's the friction when some new financing models, some innovative models, they try to enter the existing status quo of the financial system. And we see a kind of rejection from the financial system itself. So I think that the first set, which is the momentum of growth, the inability to do business unusual, and the friction that the new innovative models are having with the system, is a kind of set of barriers that I think they are not very much difficult to be addressed. Because I think that with capacity development, with a good regulatory system, these barriers could be addressed. The second set of barriers, and I think here things are becoming very serious, is the whole approach that we have designed the climate finance system. So Johanna, you asked me what we need to do to change the climate finance ecosystem. I think we should stop making reference to a climate finance ecosystem. I think we need to change the entire financial system if we want to see change. So I'll put some numbers in front of you. We need trillions. There have been some couple of hundred of millions pledged, but we have only tens of millions that we have in the big public climate finance funds. And I know that I will say here also something that many developing countries will attack me, but we should not believe that the answer to climate finance is the public finance, either the national or the international public finance. The answer to climate change is private finance. It's the $250 trillion that the global financial system is managing. So what we want is not a sectoral approach that it's only looking the additionality of some climate funds or the additionality of some small national or international funds. We need to completely change the financial system and the way that it's working. And towards this kind of objective, decarbonization of the portfolios is a very, very, very big task, I think. And I think it's going to be much more helpful if the portfolios of the private finance institutions get decarbonized than to start saying, okay, we will give so many millions in this renewable energy project or in this energy efficiency project or in this waste management project. So we need to get off an understanding that climate finance is about project financing. Climate finance is about greening the entire finance system. The third big set of obstacles, and actually yesterday I had, the day before yesterday when I was talking with George about this question, I had a problem on how I'm going to address this third set of problem, which is that the finance system, the global finance system itself is completely flooded. And something happened just the day before yesterday, so I don't need to say anything myself. I have the FinCEN report that came from the regulatory authority of the United States that says $2 trillion managed by international banks have been allocated to it's about money laundering. $2 trillion, and the report talks about names like HSBC, JP Morgan, the Deutsche Bank. So, and this is not a report of a journalist. This is not a report of an NGO. This is the report of the biggest regulatory and financial system in the United States. So the global financial system is corrupted. And I don't think that you could expect that such a system will have a tendency to change. So let me finish by just saying that we have some systemic issues that I think they could be addressed by regulatory frameworks, by capacity development, by incentives. We have the kind of climate finance architecture that needs to go off the project financing and see at the entire change of the finance system. And then we have the same kind of system itself. And I think that we need, for this last part, we need to make financial system to be legally and morally liable against climate change. Thank you very much.
Stefanos, thank you for that very straight talk with some science thrown in there as well. Serge, I'm going to turn to you now. Your organization recently released an inaugural ecological threat register. For those of you on the call, you can find a link to that in the chat function. This report connects the building ecological threats we are facing as a result of climate change to wider peace building and security concerns globally. What are the main headlines from your report, and what are their implications for peace building and the security agenda at COP26?
Well, thank you, Johanna, for the question and for giving us the opportunity to talk about the ecological threat register. And I was pleased to hear Tasneem talking about, this connection between the impact of the exposure and also the resilience, which is at the heart of the ecological threat register. And Stefanos, if you want to find trillions, every year the Institute for Economics and Peace proposes a very conservative estimation of the cost of violence, and this is around $14 trillion every year. So if we could decrease violence, maybe we could start invest this money into the coping with the effects of climate change. At IEP also, it's the first time that when, after producing a report, we now decided to engage in policy seminars leading to policy recommendations before the end of the year. And we are going to analyze 3 different aspects of the ecological threat register. We're going to look at the security aspect, we're going to look at the development aspect, and we're also going to look at the impact, or I would say the connection to multilateralism or the geopolitics of climate change. So these policy recommendations will be ready by the end of this year. So the ecological threat register covers 8 areas of ecological threats clustered in 2 domains. So we first had a look at resource scarcity with food scarcity, water scarcity, and we link this to population growth, basically looking at depletion of resources and increase of the demand. The second cluster is about natural disasters. We look at floods, droughts, cyclones, rising sea levels, and rising temperature. The resilience to ecological threats of a country shows a very high statistical association with a country's rating in positive peace. High levels of positive peace indicate high resilience. And by combining this risk of ecological threats with the resilience, we were able to identify 3 zones, 3 hotspots, where there will be high exposure, high impact, and low resilience. The first zone is the Sahel Horn of Africa belt, really going from Mauritania down to Somalia. A second one, deeper in Africa, the more southern African belt from Angola down to Mozambique and Madagascar. And the third one, starting in the Middle East, a country like Syria, and reaching through Central and South Asia to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So now the main implication for the COP26 agenda. When we look at food scarcity or food insecurity, this is clearly also, this can be a result of violence, but it's also a trigger and stressor of social tensions. In 2019, a majority of the 41 active conflicts in the world took place in a food insecure country. So first relation there. The projection to 2050, the ETR projects that about 3.5 billion people could suffer from food insecurity by 2050. Water stress, and we need to understand that food is a product of water. So today, there's 60% less fresh water per person than it was in the early 60s. So in the past 60 years, we consumed 60% of the freshwater reserves. By 2040, we estimate that 5.4 billion people will live in 59 countries experiencing high or extreme water stress. We have also seen that the number of water-related conflicts and violent incidents have already increased by 270% worldwide in the last decade. And we have also seen that mediation is used less and less to settle water-related conflicts, which now usually turn more violent. Population growth. That's clearly an accelerator of the consequences of resource scarcity. That's what I said a couple of minutes ago. 14 countries are likely to double their population over the next 30 years. Niger, for example, will face the biggest increase with 171%. Global population is projected to reach about 10 billion by 2050. And the 40 least peaceful countries will become home to more than half of the world population. So a clear connection there with half of the world population living in the 40 least peaceful countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is being the fastest growing region globally, but I think we're all aware of this. This, of course, can generate displacement. I mean, if you have depletion of resources, potential for conflict, potential also for societal collapse, and we estimate that about, when we look at these 3 hotspot zones, it's about 31 countries, about 1 billion people. And of course, those people are at risk of facing the need to move, risk of displacement, and maybe eventually risk of migration. So clearly we identified 3 migration routes that already exist today for which we might see an increased flow. And this is a route coming from South and Central America up north to the US and Canada, and 2 routes to Africa, one coming from South Asia and the Middle East, and another one coming from the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, when it comes to development assistance, or what I would call international climate aid, we see that 19 of the countries with the most ecological threats are home to 2.1 billion people. And 10 of these countries are amongst the 40 least peaceful countries on a global peace index already today. Connection there. We are basically looking at, when we see this high exposure, low resilience, what we are looking at is a potential for ecological collapse. Those societies will get fragile, will destabilize, and could eventually collapse. Out of the 22 countries most at risk, meaning they have high level of ecological threats, together with low levels of peace or low levels of resilience, only 2 of those countries are amongst the 10 largest recipients of climate aid. So only 2 of 22 most impacted countries are in the top 10 of the largest recipient of climate aid. Those are Iraq and Uganda. So there is a clear discrepancy there between the needs and the help that is provided. So I would say that there is a clear there. What I just said in the past 3-4 minutes, it's quite kind of a gloomy projection into the future, but unfortunately, it's the reality. What's going to happen in the next 30 years. So clearly, the international community participating in COP26, we would ask them to act both on the impact, containment, and in building up resilience for the countries most affected. And of course, doing this for those who will be facing potential societal collapse. And to come back a little bit to what Tasneem said, and being here in Brussels, just a couple of streets away from the EU, I think the EU Green Deal is something that is very good, but this is a continent with low or moderate impact and high levels of resilience. And I think the real impact of climate change, and the Green Deal is a good initiative, but the real impact of climate change is not in Europe, it's somewhere else in the world. So thank you for giving the chance to talk about this. And I will be more than happy to answer more questions about this. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Serge. Thank you. Now turning to you, John, and further to sort of the role of data and analysis in helping to sort of chart a practical course of action. Your work at the Earth Institute focuses on the impact of climate change on frontline communities. Can you speak to the work that you're doing and what it's telling you about possible adaptation and mitigation responses to climate change for frontline communities, policymakers, and also the implications then for the COP26 agenda?
Sure. Thank you, Johanna, and thank you for including us, and it's an honor to be here. So, as I said during the brief introduction, we work on producing primarily seasonal forecasts, so looking forward a few months into the future, and we put a lot of emphasis on communicating that information to people who need it, so that farmers, or at least agriculture extension workers, can understand what the data means for them, so they can adjust their own decisions, or public health workers, or transportation or energy utility workers. What we're seeing in terms of frontline workers, policymakers, and negotiators at the COP, to a large extent, I think, is a disconnect between the timescales that they worry about. So I think it's important to acknowledge that climate change is already happening. The climate system has changed. The chemical structure of the atmosphere has changed, and with it, the weather is changing. And yet the COP talks a lot about climate change, which to most people means what's going to happen in the next 80 to 90 years, not what's happening in the next day or the next season or the next year. But if you're a smallholder farmer or a malaria control officer or someone like that, information about what's going to happen in 80 or 90 years, which is multiple generations of people from now, is not helpful in decision making. But information about how the seasons that we are facing now are not going to be like the seasons that we have faced in the past, can empower people to make decisions based on their own knowledge of what to do. All farmers have faced a drought at some point. They may face more severe droughts, but simply knowing that the next season is going to be unusually dry, and knowing that 3 months in advance gives them an edge in thinking about what to plant, whether to plant, whether they might try to store water before the drought truly kicks in. And so thinking about Stefanos and Tasneem's comments about finance, I totally agree that finance is important, but we have to ask finance for what? And what we've seen is that when we work with governments, one of the weakest agencies that we usually encounter is the weather department, the Met Service, the meteorological service. And yet they're the source of the information that people need to respond to the challenges that we're all talking about. And so I would urge that as the mechanisms of climate finance continue to gin up and provide support, that they remember that to make a decision, an adaptive decision that will build resilience, people need access to useful information. It shouldn't be held by a private company. It should be publicly available. The sources of that data are usually paid for at some level by taxpayer money. And so in our view, they are a public good that should be publicly available. And there needs to be support for the Met Department to have the staff, the computing power, the storage capabilities, and the incentives to reach out to the Agriculture Ministry, the Health Ministry, et cetera, so that they can help their constituents, whether they be farmers or people at risk of malaria or dengue or Zika or something else. This is all very doable. The IRI, my institution, trains Met Service workers in dozens of countries across the developing world to produce cutting edge seasonal forecasts, and we're moving into sub-seasonal forecasts, so looking 10 days to 2 or 3 months. The staff that we work with take it up. We also work on the other side, on the information user side. We work with ag ministries, et cetera. And we work with insurance companies to develop insurance products that are based on weather indexes rather than actual damages done, which lowers the cost of the policy so that even very poor smallholder farmers can afford a policy. So I would urge the COP and policymakers to think about these issues that are sort of predecessors to the issues of how are you going to adapt. First, you have to know what it is you're adapting to. And that's what I feel like gets left out of the discussions at the COP and at the government level. So I'll stop there and I look forward to other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Tom, last but not least, turning to you, in your work at the Arctic Ice Project, you work on a number of sort of angles of that, but you're also looking at a basket of extremely consequential technologies and potentially powerful technologies that would essentially provide the ability to control the global thermostat. Can you say what makes these technologies so important and what concerns you see on the horizon about their regulation and governance?
Yeah. The second question is a big one, but thanks for saving me for last, because we are an additive solution, climate restoration technologies. And I think it would be good to draw a kind of a interconnect all these conversations that I'm hearing, right? And make the case for climate restoration. When I hear Stefanos speak, it's really exciting because he's building capital markets for the 21st century so that we can tap into that great wall of institutional capital, private institutional capital that's required to fund our climate agenda. And we're making advances there, and it's tremendous. And when I hear Tasmin talk, you know, she's talking a lot about holding people accountable because our core focus has to be on climate mitigation. And Serge is, you know, he mentioned the word gloomy, but I would say massively terrifying for some of these statistics in terms of climate change adaptation. And so really what we're making a case for right now is that this work is not going to be accomplished in the next 5 to 10 years. It's really to decarbonize our economy and really, you know, do this heavy lifting. It's going to take 15 years or more. And what we're facing right now is the predictable consequence of our actions, as John was speaking. Like I used to work with coffee farmers in Colombia, and they're dealing with climate change right now. And we're looking at the vital organs of our planet. And the Arctic is, of course, the one that the Arctic Ice Project is concerned about as a crucial lever of climate change. But we're looking at those potentially disappearing in the next 15 years, a very high likelihood. And when that occurs, there's no plans to refreeze the Arctic or restore the Amazon forest. It's going to lead to runaway climate change. And so in addition to climate change mitigation and adaptation, we need to add a third leg to the stool, which is climate restoration technologies. And just grab on with both hands to every solution that's available to us right now. And so I would say that's kind of, you know, how we're working together with everybody else on this call. And as a practitioner, I don't get to join a lot of these calls. Obviously, we're based in Silicon Valley and we're very focused on our work. And so it's nice to listen to this coalition of partnerships that's, I consider on the same team. And then to answer your second question, I'm sorry if I'm being a little long-winded, it's a tough one. I think that climate change is not as much a scientific problem as it's an economic and political challenge. And there are a lot of people that believe that when it comes to climate restoration, the challenge is really going to be a political one, right? Governance issues or regulation are predeterminate to scale our sector because the deployment of our technologies is going to be done through a consortium of countries, right? So really the organizations that will have to play the role there in setting that governance would have to be someone like the United Nations, the Arctic Council in our case. And, we definitely don't want to, we all say we want to have a soft feedback. So as a practitioner, we definitely are building our muscles and communicating with people as we research our technology to make sure that to validate its safety and its effectiveness over the next 5 to 7 years. But there's long papers written on that, and I could talk more. But yeah, it's probably in terms of our ecosystem a deliverable that needs to be accomplished, and it's not going to be an easy task.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have appeared in the chat, and let me really just encourage all participants to add your thoughts and questions, and I will get you in. But I want to start with a question from a participant that sort of hits at the intersection of accountability and mitigation, which is around what types of approaches or policies do you see or that we're going to need around the big emitter countries, and what do you see as being effective? Right now, we're seeing a lot of promises with very little action from many companies and governments. I'm curious to anybody who would like to respond to that question, what you think needs to happen to change things on that front. Esni, come on ahead.
Thanks. And thanks for the question. Look, I think there have been some very exciting developments. And we've witnessed successes of this. The whole area of litigation is actually a new frontier that can push, for decisive action around these things. And it's lodged both against private companies and it's lodged against governments. So there's been a wave of litigation. And so I think that's a really exciting new approach and possibly a way of getting results. But I do think, governments have made commitments, and unfortunately there's no enforcing mechanisms for this. There's no, in the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, it's all been, on a voluntary basis. So there isn't any compliance mechanism or enforcement mechanism. We're all depending on each other to do the good and right thing. And so the accountability has to come from us, the citizens. And again, we have to hold both governments and the private sector accountable. The big push to move away from fossil fuels and a fossil fuel based growth models, etc. These things have to be done by citizens. Which I also just, Johanna, if you don't mind, I want to pick up on something that Stefanos actually mentioned, the whole idea of private finance versus public finance. And he's absolutely correct. CAN International actually works in the space of building a systemic transformation of our financial systems, and we're quite active in that space. But we also recognize that while we trying to transform and overhaul this entire system, things are happening right now that can lock us into, a kind of business as usual scenario that is not going to be helpful for us on all fronts, including the climate front. And so what we're talking about, for example, in the COVID pandemic recovery is public financing. Suddenly we've seen governments able to generate all this public finance to deal with the COVID pandemic. And so we have to ensure that public finance is going to be used in the public's interest and for the public's well-being. So I just wanted to put that perspective of public finance into the picture. Completely agree that we have to green or make a sustainable financial system. Again, we have to intervene in the short term while building for that long term as well. So I think a big role is going to be on the shoulders of citizens to push and hold their governments to account, and of course companies.
Thank you, Tasneem. Serge, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to enhance or at least comment also what Tasneem had just said. I think what we have seen in research that we have done on the impact of COVID-19 on peace, we have seen that clearly these overseas development aid budgets are going to be reduced worldwide, and we already see the first effects of this. And I personally think that it's a major mistake to only concentrate on your own economy. I mean, what is your own economy worth if you not support others, or if you do not address, I would say, processes that have a deep impact on our economy? So I guess that's a mistake. And maybe a second point that we need to think about, I spoke about the policy seminars. One will be focusing on geopolitics and multilateralism. We are also shifting at that level from a more collaborative approach to international relations into a more competitive approach to international relations, as we are starting to experience it right now. And this is also going to have a negative impact on those potential financing and the potential influence of major actors in different parts of the world where climate change, where ecological threats are already rampaging at the moment. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to come in on this first question? Go ahead, Stefanos.
Thanks, Johanna. So I'll start where Tasneem talked at one moment, says that, you know, the word enforcement, at least in the international agenda, it's something like non-existing. And I would say it's not only the UNFCCC, Tasneem. I mean, the entire UN system, with the exception of the Security Council that could enforce a decision with sanctions, all other UN decisions internationally are voluntary. But I think that when it comes to enforcement, something that could make the difference is what, Tasneem, you mentioned in your first introduction, the loss and damage mechanisms. I mean, an evolution there could make really the difference and hold accountable the countries. Another thing I would say, and I will go back to the finance system, is having accountable the finance system. So it's difficult to hold accountable a government, but it's more easier to create regulations that they will hold accountable private companies. And when we have the private companies that they are the ones that they are moving the majority of the funds, and I'm not talking about climate finance, the majority of the financial resources, then I think accountability could become an issue to be discussed between the regulators and the regulated. Thank you.
Super. John or Tom, anything on this first question? Okay. So let me come in with a second question. It's really a theme that I've heard from each of you, and certainly something that we've encountered in our work as we've worked to stand up a new climate action initiative at the Open Society Foundation, which really seeks to unlock levers of change in many of the areas that you all have mentioned. And it really, my question revolves around the massive collective action problem and opportunity that is climate change. You've each talked about the challenges of alignment, coordination, sort of joining forces to become really a force multiplier on these issues. If I might ask you, and I would expect that each of you has both sort of a positive example and maybe also sort of a horror story about where this hasn't worked and where the implications are. Where do you see that alignment working well? Where do you see a real opportunity for more, to do more of that? And what do you think absolutely needs to happen in terms of different stakeholders, groups, your own organization with others? Where do you hope to build greater connective tissue to drive climate impacts, whether mitigation or adaptation? John, please.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. For a long time before coming to Columbia, I was at USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. I led the adaptation work in the climate office there. And both there and now, I do a lot of work at the government level. And so my perspective is often skewed by that. But one of the things that I've struggled with throughout is, I guess, because the UNFCCC grew out of the Rio Summit, an environment summit, climate has sort of been viewed as an environment issue. And I was working in one of the countries in the Caribbean a few years ago, and we were really trying to get the sectoral ministries of the government to view climate change as their problem, not simply a problem for the Meteorological Service. And finally, at the end of a 2-day workshop, I was standing at the back during a coffee break, and somebody kind of tapped me on the shoulder, and it was the finance minister who had given opening comments. And we had these word clouds going up on the screen during the break, and one of them was showing economic sectors that the participants from across the government had identified as really drivers of growth, and threats to that, and climate and non-climate. And the finance minister tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You see all those sectors? I'm responsible for all of those. And you see all those problems? Those are my problems I see now. And you know, when you invited me to this workshop, I asked my staff, don't they want the environment minister? This seems like his problem. And now when I go back, I'm going to ask them why they haven't been bugging me with this for the last 20 years, because clearly this is my problem, not just an environment problem." And so I think the challenge that could help to some of the motivation question that we were dealing with in the last question is helping people understand that this is not strictly an environment issue. It is an economic issue. It is a social and cultural issue. And it undercuts everything that we're trying to do. So as we watch California burn and other parts of the country, of the world grapple with drought, we're entering a La Nina, all of these things are going to have impacts that aren't just environmental, they're economic. And so as people start to see the challenge in their own worldview and in their own issues, in their own areas of responsibility, I hope that can drive the type of cooperation that we need to have, so that a friend of mine that I used to work with in Niger, in West Africa, said that the Meteorological Service will never be the most powerful ministry in the government. But if the powerful ministries understand that how important the Meteorological Service is to the powerful success, they can at least become vital and important. And I think that's where we need to go. And I think that sort of mind shift on whether this is just an environmental problem or a socioeconomic and cultural problem could help drive that.
Yeah, and if I could jump in there, I mean, I think that John's hit the nail on the head, if that's the right expression, which is, you know, even our solution is going to take billions of dollars to implement, right? And so we're going to build off the shoulders of an efficient capital markets intermediary. And it can't just be the private sector, it also has to be the public sector that steps in a big way in the next 5 to 7 years and finances this. And so that's right now, I think that even our solutions are relying upon philanthropic capital, but philanthropy isn't scalable. And so if we don't, you know, have that kind of knowledge that John says, that these are economic, these are political problems that are happening right now, and we don't start moving on those issues, we will hit a wall in 5 to 7 years. It's just speaking selfishly about our own project.
Super, Tom. Tasneem, I saw your hand and I'll come to you, but just a quick comment for me, moderator's privilege, that certainly at the Open Society Foundations, we're trying to sort of enter into the climate space from that political perspective. And one of the exercises I was asked to do as we were considering stepping into this space was looking at what the trends in the donor community have been around what they're funding. And you're exactly right, it has been, up until recently, a lot of really great work funding sort of more technology-focused solutions. But I will say in the past year, I have seen a real momentum and a recognition by funders and others recognizing that climate change is a political and an economic problem and a social mobilization problem as much as an environmental problem as well. Tasneem, over to you.
Thanks, Johanna. So I think that in addition to what others have been saying, you know, for me, the exciting thing about this wider coalescing around the issue of the climate emergency has actually come off the back of, as you say, social mobilization. So, you know, it's taken a long time for this to hit political agendas across the board, also in different sectors. But when the youth started mobilizing, not that there's never been action and pushing before that, but certainly in the recent times, especially off the back of the IPCC report, which has been a fundamental game changer, you know, we've seen a wider coalescing around the recognition of a climate emergency. And so I think the opportunities for collaboration, even, you know, it might be at the level of rhetoric in some quarters, certainly that wider collaboration and mobilization is something that I think is an exciting area to pursue. But then I also think that we can coalesce around you know, the issues that Stefanos has raised about the financial system, because again, with this COVID pandemic, you know, there has to be systemic change, and linked to that, of course, what we cannot ignore and doesn't need massive investments in massive solutions. You know, if we can address, it actually speaks to Serge's point about, you know, where are these impacts being felt, where we need to actually build resilience. And a lot of this has got to do with addressing fundamental things like poverty and addressing inequality and building the abilities of people. Just by addressing poverty and equality will take us a long way. And so I think, yes, of course, there can be big solutions and we need to fund big solutions, but also do not lose focus that those who are most impacted on and most vulnerable are actually those living in poverty and suffering inequality. And so I don't think we must lose sight. The IPCC supports that as well. And so I hope that we can coalesce around that agenda, ending poverty, ending inequality, and I would support the whole thing about ending conflicts and building peace.
Super. So multi-solving approach and the complementarity and connectivity between all of these issues. Serge, I see you. Please come on in.
Thank you very much. Yeah, just wanting to also continue on this point. I think the mistake that we should not do is only focus on the environmental aspects of the question you just asked. I think when we created this concept of positive peace, we found that the same factors which create peace also create a whole lot of other things, of which better performance on ecological measures is one of the things we discovered also. So basically what I'm trying to say is that your level of positive peace as an influence on the impact that the natural disaster can have on your society. And what Tasneem has said, like those societies with low levels of positive peace, facing conflict, also facing poverty, hunger, poverty, things like this, will be more impacted by the same type of natural disaster than countries with high levels of positive peace. So if you want to change this resilience, this must be a system thinking approach, a systemic change. And it's not only concentrating on the effects of climate change or what needs to be invested in climate change, but it must be broader, really focusing on different pillars of positive peace that we have determined. And just to name some, of course, we need to have better governance when it comes to climate aid and climate change, but we also need to fight corruption, making sure that when there is investment, then it goes to the right, to the people who really need it. A better free flow of information, equitable distribution of resources, development of human capital. You need to invest in all of this to see transformation that can then be sustainable. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Stefanos, you have the last word, and then I'm going to close us out for the day.
Thank you, Johanna. So I want to focus on something you said, how we can adapt, climate activities and ambition to COVID. And I don't want to say something that it comes from me, but I want to say something that the Secretary General said yesterday in the opening of the General Assembly. So he asked countries to consider 6 climate positive actions as the countries rescue, rebuild, and reset their economies after the COVID. And these 6 actions is make societies more resilient and ensure just transition, focus on green jobs and sustainable growth, end fossil fuel subsidies. I repeat, end. The Secretary General said end. He didn't say rationalize or reduce. He said take climate risk into account in all financial decision making, work together and leave no one behind. And I think this would be how I would like to close my intervention. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, let me thank you so much, each of our esteemed panelists, for your incredible remarks, and also to our participants for your questions. I think I am going to sleep a little bit better at night knowing that each of you is doing the work that you're doing. And a special big thanks to the World Humanitarian Forum, George in particular, and your entire team for really coordinating and architecting a quite seamless conversation, which I feel has really exemplified a sort of interconnective alignment of minds thinking alike. Let me thank you again, remind you that your outcomes from this conversation will feed into the continuing conversation that WHF will take forward on the road to COP26. Thank you. Bye-bye.